Unprecedented pandemic spending, hundreds of billions of dollars. The Liberals deliver their first federal budget in 2 years. With so many Canadians worried about their finances and their futures, what will the path forward look like? It all comes in the middle of an ongoing crisis, a third wave gripping much of Canada. COVID cases are soaring, the healthcare system is struggling, but so too are businesses.
Having to lay off all of your employees is terrible.
My shop has been running off of a line of credit.
It's been a tumultuous year of restrictions and closures. Canadians worried about making ends meet.
It's been a roller coaster.
Oh my goodness.
Women hit especially hard.
I had to choose a full-time career or my mental health.
So how will this budget balance the needs of now with the recovery of the future? And will it secure enough support to keep this minority government going? If not, this could trigger an election. Welcome to a budget day unlike any other. Hello there, you are looking live at a scene that played out just moments ago. The Prime Minister and the Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland arriving with copies, hard copies of their very first budget in 2 years. There was an election in between, there was a pandemic in between. That is our first look at the cover of the budget too. So the first budget in 2 years, and also importantly, the first budget delivered by a female finance minister in this country's history. And we will hear more about the details of that very soon. Hello there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Any moment now, as I said, we will get some details about this first budget that we have seen, a historic budget, of course, for so many reasons. That was the Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister just heading into the House of Commons here behind me. I am in West Bloc, where things will get underway very soon. Obviously, over the past 12 months, there has been an unprecedented level of spending, and we are expecting even more from this first budget from Chrystia Freeland. We've seen billions go out the door to date in order to support Canadians and Canadian businesses throughout this pandemic. We expect to see much more today as the government believes that more stimulus is needed, somewhere in the order of $70 to $100 billion over the next 3 years. So we are here live on Parliament Hill in the foyer, and in keeping with everything from this past year, you can well imagine the scene here is a little strange, perhaps starting to look a little more familiar. There are very few MPs up here, very few reporters. I'm here with just a camera person helping me out. Everyone trying to keep COVID safe in these times. The scene inside the House of Commons also unusual because there are a limited number of people allowed inside the House as well. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland will be there, of course. She will be delivering her speech shortly. The Prime Minister will be there, but most MPs will be joining virtually on their screens from home. We're expecting all that to get underway in just a few minutes, and to help us through with all of that coverage, we will be bringing in David Cochrane. He has been in the so-called lockup, a virtual lockup this year, going through a very lengthy document, more than 700 pages of this budget, and he will bring us the details of what he has spent the day reading. Vashi Kapelis and I don't have all those details, so Vashi, the host of Power and Politics, will bring us analysis and the politics of what's going on here, because there's a lot of that at play as well. And our senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong, has been also looking at the documents, and will look at the economics of this and how this might set the country on a path to growth post-pandemic. David and Peter can't talk yet because we have to wait for the embargo to be lifted, but Vashi is here, and Vashi, I'm sure, has lots to say. So I can hold up the budget now if the Prime Minister's done it, I suppose, Vashi. I have yet to crack my copy because I wasn't allowed to, but you can get a sense of the length. And I know that might be a silly thing to say, but there's a lot in here because the government has to do a lot with this budget.
Yeah, it's a big book, so we've heard. I don't have a copy yet, but I saw the one that you're holding up, and it certainly looks as big as we anticipated it might be. Yeah. Two things politically that I'm really focused on, Rosie, as far as that goes. First of all, it's big because they are going to talk about what the recovery post-pandemic looks like. The problem is, as you outlined introducing this special, that isn't really top of mind for many Canadians who are instead facing a surge of the pandemic where they live. And so I'm interested to see how they navigate that from a messaging or political or communications perspective. So, for example, is more emphasis put on what's in this budget to deal with the pandemic and with the surge that so many of us are facing right now? And how do they balance that against kind of laying out their vision for a recovery that just seems so far away, I think, for many of us? And then on the second thing I'm really focused on is, you and I, I was saying this in the previous show, if this were 2 years ago and a minority government were laying out its budget, the politics of this would be, you know, very hyped up. And the possibility of the government for perhaps not being able to proceed because opposition parties opposed it and didn't vote in favor of a confidence vote, or didn't vote in support of a confidence vote, would mean that we would face an election. That possibility has been diminished so much that we actually have one of the opposition parties, the NDP, saying they're not going to vote against it, already explicitly saying that. And so that changes the political dynamic of all of this pretty significantly, and I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Okay, thank you for that, Vashi. I'll just check now. Is that the minister speaking? Yep, the finance minister's on her feet, giving her speech. We will dip into that briefly, and then we'll pull out so we can get some of the details from David Cochrane here now, the Finance Minister of Canada and Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you so much.
That's the Finance Minister. That's the Finance Minister tabling the documents, as you must do inside the House of Commons, in order for the embargo to be lifted and in order for the Finance Minister to begin speaking, which I believe she's going to do in just a moment. Remember, the last picture we had of the Canadian economy came back in November.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by taking a moment to mourn the tragedy in Nova Scotia a year ago yesterday. To the families and friends of the 22 people who were killed, and to all Nova Scotians, we grieve with you. This is also a day when people across Canada are fighting the most virulent wave of the virus we've experienced so far. Healthcare workers in many provinces are struggling to keep ICUs from overflowing, and millions of Canadians are facing stringent new restrictions. We're all tired, frustrated, and even afraid. But we will get through this. We'll do it together. Ce budget vise à finir la lutte contre la COVID.
This budget is about finishing the fight against COVID. It's about healing the economic wounds left by the COVID recession. And it's about creating more jobs, as well as prosperity for Canadians in the days and in the decades to come.
L'objectif est de répondre aux besoins urgents.
The goal is to meet the urgent needs of today and to build for the long term. This is a budget focused on middle-class Canadians. It's focused on pulling more Canadians up into the middle class. This is a plan that embraces this moment of global transformation to a green and clean economy.
This budget addresses three fundamental challenges. First, we need to conquer COVID. That means buying vaccines and supporting provincial and territorial healthcare systems. It means enforcing our quarantine rules at the border and within the country. It means providing Canadians and Canadian businesses with the support they need to get through these tough third-wave lockdowns and to come roaring back when the economy fully reopens. Second, we must punch our way out of the COVID recession. That means ensuring lost jobs are recovered as swiftly as possible and hard-hit businesses rebound quickly. It means providing support where COVID has struck the hardest, to women, to young people, to low-wage workers, and to small and medium-sized businesses, especially in tourism and hospitality. The final challenge is to build a more resilient Canada. Better, more fair, more prosperous, and more innovative. That means investing in Canada's green transition and the green jobs that go with it, in Canada's digital transformation and Canadian innovation, and in building infrastructure for a dynamic, growing country. And it means providing Canadians with social infrastructure. From early learning.
Okay, that is the Finance Minister beginning her speech inside the House of Commons. We will go back to her, but first let's go to David Cochrane because he was looking at that 739 pages in the budget, David, and you've got a lot there, including some pretty massive social programs that will have a real changing impact on this country if it all goes as they hope it will.
Yeah, Rosie, a significant amount of spending, too much to get into in one conversation, but I'll start with the top line numbers. There's $101.4 billion in new spending over 3 years. Chrystia Freeland, the first woman to deliver a federal budget, the first working mother to do so, and she makes a big investment right off the top in childcare. There is $30 billion over the next 5 years, including $8.3 billion a year for every year after that, to move to a national childcare and early learning program. The short-term goal is to cut fees by 50% as soon as next year, and then by 2025 to have all Canadians have access to childcare at a cost of $10 a day. Now that's for the future. There's a lot of focus on here and now, and that of course is the pandemic. And because of that, the big support programs that have kept a lot of people above water throughout this last year are being extended until September. That's the wage subsidy, the rent subsidy, the lockdown supports. Those are all being extended at a cost of $30 billion. The Canada Recovery Benefit that puts money in people's pockets directly, that's being extended for another 12 weeks of eligibility. Now, 4 weeks of that is at the current $500. The final 8 weeks will be at $300. They're starting to ramp some of this down to try to encourage people to get back to work if possible. And on that theme, they're bringing in a whole new program called the Canada Recovery Hiring Program. It's $600 million that will cover up to 50% of payroll for a company for every new hire they make or increase in hours that they give to existing employees. So new money on the table, an extension of programs to deal with the crisis of the moment. And then when we get through the COVID crisis, there's billions more to deal with the climate crisis, including $5 billion over 7 years to help with the Net Zero Accelerator, the idea to invest in technology and the advancement of innovation that will get the country closer to meeting its net zero emissions by 2050. They're offering tax cuts of up to 50% of corporate tax cut and small business tax cuts to manufacturers, companies that make net zero technologies. There's also $4.4 billion over 5 years for home retrofits, so that people through the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation can get an interest-free loan of $40,000 to make their home more energy efficient, then pay it back over time. And all of that, Rosie, plus more, leads into a new target for 2030 that Canada is going to seek to reduce its emissions by 36% below 2005. That's up from 30%. All of this big spending, Rosie, comes with a big cost. The deficits for the year just ended, $354 billion. The one we're in, $155 billion. And then you can see as the COVID programs wind down, the deficits get back to where they were at their pre-pandemic levels, getting to about $30.7 billion in 25-26. At that point, Rosie, the debt will have more than doubled to $1.4 trillion. It's an enormous cost that the finance minister says is necessary because of the toll this pandemic took on poor people, young people, and seniors, and there are support programs in this budget for them. First, an establishment of a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour, something that poverty advocates and labor groups have been advocating for years. There's $8.9 billion over 6 years to expand the Canada Workers Benefit. That will put more money in the pockets of low-income working families and individuals in this country. And there's also that long-promised boost to the old age security benefit, a $500 one-time payment coming this summer and 10% increase for people over the age of 75 coming next year. And on top of all of that, Rosie, there's money for training, youth, Indigenous, small businesses. This is the first budget since the last election, likely the last budget before the next one, and it's a budget that leaves no voters behind.
Okay, lots in there, and we'll dig into more of the details, David, but thank you for that overview. I think probably most people want to hear more details about childcare, because that is a topic that affects so many Canadians across the country, and as we know, economists say, affects the macroeconomics of this country as well in terms of getting people into the labor force. But let's go back inside the House of Commons. The Finance Minister still delivering the budget, and we'll pop back out to get a look at what this does to the Canadian economy in just a moment, but let's listen now to Chrystia Freeland.
We will create nearly 500,000 new training and work experience opportunities for Canadians. We will fulfill our throne speech commitment to create 1 million jobs by the end of this year. Some will say our sense of urgency is misplaced. Some will say that we're spending too much. To them, I ask this: did you lose your job during a COVID lockdown? Were you reluctantly let go by your small business employers who were like a family to you, but simply could not afford your salary any longer? Are you worried you'll be laid off in this third wave? Are you a mother forced to quit the dream job you fought to get because there was no way to keep working while caring for your young children? Did you graduate last spring, and are you still struggling to find work? Is your family business, launched perhaps by your parents, and which you'd hope to pass on to your children, now struggling under a sudden burden of debt and fending off bankruptcy through sheer grit and determination every day? If COVID has taught us anything, it's that we're all in this together. Our country cannot.
All right, that is the Finance Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, still delivering her speech here on her first budget, the first budget in a couple of years. Of course, there was slated to be one after the election, and that got interrupted and pushed back because of the pandemic. We've had a couple of fiscal snapshots since then, most recently this past fall, but this is really our best and clearest picture of how much the government has spent on the pandemic and what it sees as the way out of this and how it plans to create growth. And so to that end, let's bring in our senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong, to talk a bit about that in terms of where does the growth come from and how much of it is just betting that all this money, $101 billion of stimulus, is going to do that for them, Peter.
It's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting, isn't it? You know, Rosie, I've said this to you before, that on budget days and economic update days, I have the easiest job, that I get to ignore the flowery rhetoric and all the words, and I just go to the back and I pull out the annexes and I see what the numbers actually tell us. And the numbers in this are staggering. They are large, they are sweeping, and they are across the board. And it's not just COVID or childcare, it's everything. And yeah, they're going to wind down some of the bigger programs, but going forward, the number that jumps out at me is the one that Dave Cochran just mentioned, $354.2 billion as the deficit. And look at those numbers. I mean, Vashi was talking earlier about how we would have reacted to a budget like this 2 years ago. If we had looked at these numbers 2 years ago, people would have literally been falling out of their chairs. Look at not just the 354, but the 154. And if you go out to the end of the forecast at 30.7 billion, the last time we saw a budget, we were all losing our collective minds at the prospect of a $19.8 billion yearly deficit. So things have obviously changed, and the way in which we're spending is changing with it. And as I say, it's not just COVID, and childcare is going to get an awful lot of attention today. But for example, transfers to elderly benefits, so, you know, old age security, stuff like that, is the biggest ticket item in any budget, and it's going up by $4.2 billion a year for the next bunch of years. We're seeing a drastic increase in how much we're spending, and you know, we go from, if you look at total program expenses, which is, you know, again, my job's easy. I go to these graphs, I pull out the numbers. We go from $338 billion in the year that just ended up to $426.7 billion in program expenses by the end of the sort of period that we're looking at in this budget. So it's an astonishing amount of money, and it is hopefully the thing that will help spur the economy along, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the economic forecasts that are showing growth is already coming. So, you know, what impact will all this have?
And shockingly enough, Peter, that number, $354 billion in a deficit, actually less than what we had thought going in. So yeah, you're right. Our mentality has changed around these kinds of huge numbers, perhaps just because of the pandemic. But we'll talk more in a moment. Thanks so much for that, Peter. Appreciate it. Let's go back inside the House of Commons to hear more from the Finance Minister, and then we'll get into the possible politics of this and anything else that Vashi Kapelis is noticing as she's speed reading through all of this right now. Here now, again, the Finance Minister.
This budget will introduce a $15 an hour federal minimum wage. COVID has exposed the dangerous inadequacy of sickness benefits in Canada. We will do our part and fulfill our campaign commitment by extending EI sickness benefits from 15 to 26 weeks.
We know the pandemic has exacerbated systemic barriers faced by racialized Canadians. So, Budget 2021 provides additional funding for the Black Entrepreneurship Program, as well as an investment in a Black-led philanthropic endowment fund to help fight anti-Black racism and improve social and economic outcomes in Black communities. One of the most striking aspects of the pandemic has been the historic sacrifice young Canadians have made to protect their parents and grandparents. Our youth have paid a high price to keep the rest of us safe. We cannot, and we will not, allow young Canadians to become a lost generation. They need our support to launch their adult lives and careers in post-COVID Canada, and they will get it. We will invest $5.7 billion over 5 years in Canada's youth. We will make college and university
There's a little bit more of the
accessible
Deputy
and
Prime Minister delivering her first speech inside the House of Commons, talking particularly about what this budget will do for racialized Canadians and for young Canadians, both of them deeply affected by this pandemic. Let's bring in Vashi Kapelis, the host of Power and Politics, again for some initial thoughts as you've been ripping through everything like I have, Vashi. It does seem as though they are trying to put a lens on the people who were most impacted by the pandemic, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And like you, I've sort of been looking through it as fast as I can. It's a big document. I think the childcare announcement, obviously, as our two other colleagues have pointed out, is a marquee part of the budget. But a couple other things that have jumped out to me, if I'm looking through it with a political lens, is first of all the overall, like, there's something in here for everyone and for every political party too. And I say that because there were these conversations that took place, for example, in advance of the introduction of the budget between the Prime Minister and opposition leaders in many press conferences over the past week, in which opposition leaders have laid out what they had hoped to see in this budget. And I noticed, for example, the NDP had talked extensively about daycare. That, as we just discussed, that's in there. The Bloc had talked extensively about additional supports for seniors. That's in there to the tune of many billions of extra dollars as well, promised here. The Conservative leader had talked about jobs, and that's certainly in here, but more specifically also about mental health supports. There's a whole section on that in here as well. The Green Party had talked about more student supports, and we just heard the Finance Minister talk about some of the stuff that this budget does or the measures that it introduces to help young Canadians affected by the pandemic. So certainly through a political pandemic lens, I guess you could call it, there is not everything that all the parties were looking for in here, but there is something for each of them, which again sort of further complicates or maybe makes more interesting the political calculation that they have to make in deciding whether or not to support or oppose this budget, and then in what way they actually end up doing that.
Yeah, and we're going to hear from opposition leaders pretty soon. It would be pretty hard, I would think, for the NDP, who asked for additional paid sick leave and has got it here in the form of $3 billion over 5 years, who has been asking for years for a $15 guaranteed wage minimum wage. Thank you.
Yes.
And they got it in this budget as well. So, I mean,
pharmacare isn't in here to the degree they wanted. That's the only thing I'd flag, but a lot of other stuff is.
Yeah, and it was so it would be difficult I mean, not impossible. I'm sure they could find a way, but difficult to manufacture a reason to vote against this. Remember, the government only needs one other party, of course, in order to survive. Thank you, Vashi. We'll come back to you. I'll let you keep reading away there. And I'll go now to our CBC poll analyst, Eric Grenier. This is, as we've been talking about, a minority parliament. We're always in a state of readiness here in Ottawa. Eric, just remind us where things stand right now. I mean, put aside the fact that we are in the midst of a pandemic, a very severe third wave in large parts of this country, which obviously would impact the timing of things here, but just remind us what it would look like if we were to find ourselves in the midst of an election.
Yeah, and I think it's worth reminding viewers that, as they probably know, a lot of Canadians don't want to have an election in the short term. Polling has suggested very few Canadians want to see an election in the spring, maybe the fall, maybe afterwards. Whenever it does happen, if the Liberals have the kind of numbers they have in the polls right now, it would be good for them. So if the other opposition parties are looking for something to find to support the budget, might actually work out in their favor, because where the polls stand right now in our polling averages, the Liberals are leading right now with about 36% support. They have a lead of just over 6 points over the Conservatives, which is a sizable lead, especially when you think that they have a double-digit lead in Ontario. They're ahead of the Bloc Québécois in Quebec. They're leading in British Columbia, Atlantic Canada. That puts them in more or less a majority government position. They are in that territory right now. One of the reasons is that the NDP is at about 17% support right now in the polls. Not enough to have them lose a lot of seats, but enough. But also not enough to really challenge the Liberals. And that would be one of the calculations for the New Democrats, is that if there was an election right now, the NDP might end up picking up a couple extra seats here or there, but it could come at the expense of a Liberal majority government, and then they would lose the leverage that they've had in this minority House of Commons. So I think for the New Democrats, they might be able to go through this budget, find a few things that they can say is there because the NDP asked for it, and find a way to avoid an election, at least in the short term.
A lot of this, as we've said, there's a lot of things in here for a lot of Canadians, but a lot of it directed towards women who have been, we've seen, disproportionately forced out of the labor market. The childcare program is one of them, but there's some other things there as well. And I don't question that they want to help women, but there's a political motivation behind that as well too, Eric.
Certainly, one of the biggest divides that we have in Canada in terms of politics is the gender divide. The Conservatives and the Liberals are often neck and neck. Sometimes the Conservatives are ahead of the Liberals among male voters. Among women, female voters, the Liberals are usually well ahead of the Conservatives. So they know that this is a demographic that is largely in favor of the Liberal Party. So certainly it's not going to hurt them politically. Though it's interesting to see that in a poll that was done by Ipsos just before the budget came out, asking Canadians to rank their various asks in the budget, a national childcare program was pretty far back at only about 8% of people had it in their top three. So while it might be something that's good for the future in terms of a future election, something to bring to the table, in the short term, Canadians are primarily concerned about COVID-19 and getting the economy going again.
Okay, Eric, thank you for that reminder of where things are at. Appreciate it. We'll come back to you throughout our special. We'll go back to the finance minister now briefly. She is still delivering her budget inside the House of Commons.
Canadian Technology Corps and sending them out to work with our small and medium-sized businesses. This groundbreaking program will help Canadian small businesses go digital and become more competitive and efficient.
Increased funding for the Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative will help provide financing to innovative Canadian businesses so they can grow. We will also encourage businesses to invest in themselves. We will allow immediate expensing of up to $1.5 million.
Okay, we're going to say goodbye now to viewers in Newfoundland and Labrador on CBC Television. Special coverage continues for the rest of the country on CBC and CBC News Network and CBC Gen.
These larger deductions will support 325,000 businesses in making critical investments and will represent $2.2 billion in total savings to them over the next 5 years. building for the future.
Okay, we are going to leave the finance minister again now briefly. Her speech is long because the budget is long, more than 700 pages, and we want to try and bring you the news that matters the most to you and the headlines that matter the most to you throughout all of this, because we are living in extraordinary times. The pandemic is still raging through parts of this country, especially here in Ontario, but also creating real problems in Alberta, in British Columbia, in other parts of the country too. The national case count has been climbing now since the beginning of March, fueled at this point primarily by variants of concern. The 7-day average has now surpassed the peak of the second wave. Today's provincial numbers are still rolling in through the day, but so far, more than 5,600 new cases have been added to the total today. I would point out the vast majority of those coming from Ontario. My next guest, Dr. Alexander Wong, is an infectious disease physician in Regina. Nice to see you, Dr. Wong. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Rosie.
So obviously, in a regular budget, I probably wouldn't be talking to you, but there's nothing usual about what we're living through and nothing usual about this budget either. I would note that the government is trying to do a couple of things that have been sort of exposed through the pandemic. There's $3 billion over 5 years for long-term care. There's an attempt to help older Canadians as well. What do you make of sort of some of those, reaching out to some of those groups who we've seen have been far more vulnerable during all of this?
I think it's important and absolutely necessary that the Liberals chose to extend, rent and wage subsidies, as well as putting dollars into long-term care. Obviously, that was a massive vulnerability, and long-term care facilities and residents and their families were devastated over the course of the first and second waves of the pandemic, and would have been devastated in the third wave had it not been for vaccine. Paid sick leave is also in here to a degree, although not necessarily something immediate. So as you've said, there is something here for everyone, and now's not the time, I think, to really be tight on the purse strings.
I will also point to the mental health too. $45 million over 2 years to Health Canada, $100 million over 3 years to the Public Health Agency of Canada, and there's other. And I would only point to that because I know so many doctors, Dr. Wong, are concerned about sort of the after effects of the pandemic and how this has affected so many Canadians' mental health, and I know that speaks to a lot of people as well.
For sure. I think there's kind of the direct and indirect effects of COVID. I mean, for persons who actually have had COVID and recovered, there's a lot of people who are suffering sort of long-term sort of psychiatric complications and sequelae from that. And then obviously for everybody else in society that's had to struggle with regards to isolation, all the various challenges that we've had to deal with the pandemic as well. So it's a bit of a tip of the cap there. Not a ton of dollars, but certainly better than nothing.
I'll just end on this, Dr. Wong. At a time when we are, in the province of Ontario, really struggling, but we're starting to see that same issue break out in BC and Alberta. Do you think that this budget has done what it needs to do in terms of, is still being there to support Canadians over the next however long it takes us to get on the other side of this?
I think so. Again, it needed to be a budget that reached out to everyone and acknowledged the financial, economic realities of everyone in this country. It has really taken a toll on individuals, families, and businesses all alike. And so, it's one that I think will be difficult to oppose and will push through. And it's encouraging, I think, for us to know that there's the desire, I think, to try to get the economy back on track as we work our way through this third wave.
All right, Dr. Wong, thank you so much for making the time for us today. Appreciate it. We'll come back to you if we need to. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie.
Okay, be well. I'll go back to my colleague David Cochran, who's got more details from what's inside the budget. David, I'll just let you go where you want to go, and I'll speak if I need to.
Yeah, Rosie, I'm going to do a prop because I'm going to show you. Held up the size of this budget. Yeah. This is the last one. That's the Bill Morneau budget. Look at the size difference. So you use this one to kill a bug, this one to kill a rat, because we're dealing with, quite a serious problem. So Chrystia Freeland has poured a lot of spending into this. But look, there's a broad theme to everything they're trying to do here. There is a lot of spending, as Peter went through. You're seeing programming spending going up by about $100 billion over a period of time consistently in the annual budget. The argument that's coming from all of these things is that it adds to the economic growth and the potential of the country, that this is about unlocking productivity. And I'll use childcare as one example. By getting childcare down to $10 a day and making it affordable and allowing primarily women to go into the workforce, Chrystia Freeland told us in a briefing earlier today that they think this can add 1.2% to the GDP. And they have studies from TD Economics, for example, that says that, for every dollar you pour into early childhood education, the broader economy gets $1.50 or $2.80 in return. So again, they're making this as an argument of economic potential being unleashed by these investments. The green agenda is the same sort of thing, that it's going to make Canada more competitive, it's going to attract investment into the industries and the technologies of tomorrow and move away from sort of the industries of the past. So I understand Erin O'Toole is speaking, so I'm going to stop talking. All right.
Okay, thanks, David. We'll come back to you. Don't worry. Here now, the Leader of the Official Opposition, Mr. O'Toole.
But this budget does nothing to answer the calls from Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta, and other provinces asking for more vaccines. Justin Trudeau has moved too slow for this virus. It's racing ahead of us now. And now he is slow in providing real help for Canadians in this budget. This disappointment needs to stop. Nous sommes dans la troisième vague.
We are in the middle of Justin Trudeau's third wave. The Liberals acted too slowly to counter this virus, and now in his budget, Justin Trudeau is slow to help Canadians.
For an economic recovery plan that improves their personal financial security by creating jobs, increasing wages, and lowering taxes. Unfortunately, this budget does next to nothing to secure the Canadian economy. Unemployed Canadians hoping to find work, workers who've had their wages cut due to lockdowns, and families hoping for lower taxes to pay down their mortgage or to save for their children's education, they're all going to feel let down by this Liberal budget. They continue to be left behind by Mr. Trudeau. This budget will not secure the economy for unemployed Canadians and workers who've lost their jobs due to lockdowns. Families hoping to lower taxes and get ahead are not being listened to. They're all going to be asking for more. Ce budget ne protège pas l'économie.
This budget does not protect the economy. It leaves Canadians behind, especially workers whose wages went down because of lockdown. He is abandoning families who were hoping for lower taxes in order to pay down their mortgage or save money for their children's education. Once again, Canadians will feel abandoned by the Liberals.
The Prime Minister also wants to test an out-of-control debt plan without any real stimulus, one that abandons the natural resource sector entirely and provides no real fiscal anchor. This Ottawa knows best approach will continue to lead in ballooning housing costs, higher taxes, growing risk of inflation, and will leave millions of Canadians behind. This budget has no real plan for small business or for students, only offering temporary band-aids to these thousands of Canadians. Canada's Conservatives have put forward the Canada Recovery Plan to secure your personal finances by recovering the 1 million jobs lost during the pandemic and even more, by supporting the sectors hit hardest by the pandemic, and by helping those who have suffered the most throughout it, particularly women and young Canadians.
Conservatives brought in the Canada Recovery Plan. That plan will protect your personal finances by bringing back the money lost during this pandemic. We will be supporting the hardest hit sectors as well as helping those who are suffering the most, such as women and young people.
All right, that is some initial reaction there from the Leader of the Official Opposition, Erin O'Toole, calling out the government for things that he believes are missing there. I'll bring in Vashi Kapelis and David Cochrane to fact check some of that. One of the things that the Conservative leader had promised in his own speech about 3 weeks ago, was create 1 million jobs. I would point out that the budget itself says that the government, Canada, is well on track to have create 1 million jobs by the end of the year, and that this budget alone will create 500,000 jobs. And there's some other, the budget addresses all of the points that he was making there, though perhaps not in the way that he wants them to, Vashi.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of curious for the next comments, which are in what different ways would his party address those issues? So that the point or the argument that he's putting forth is overall, there's nothing in here to secure the economy more long term. And he highlighted certain groups, certain constituencies of people who have been primarily negatively affected by the pandemic that he says this doesn't do anything to address. Like, it doesn't help people get for example, who have lost their jobs because of the pandemic or lost hours because of the pandemic. There is a new benefit created in here that, to my understanding, at least from what I've read, is aimed at that issue. Maybe he means more in the long term, and to that effect, he talked about there's no lower taxes, for example, for the average family who is hoping to pay down the mortgage faster or who was worried about their incomes. That certainly is true, but it seems to me, I'm trying to discern here, I guess he's saying that the measures introduced here maybe address things in the more short term, but not necessarily in the long term, which is, again, a interesting argument to make just because of all the spending that is in here for the long term. And so maybe there'll be more that he'll say about his assessment of how effective or not those long-term measures will be at actually creating more jobs, at doing the kinds of things that he has advocated for. But it seems like he's trying to make the argument that this budget falls short in making life more secure for families in the long term.
I'll get David's assessment there, and then maybe we'll dip back into Mr. O'Toole.
Yeah, I'll go through three specific things. Support for small and medium-sized businesses. There's $4 billion in this budget for what's called the Canada Digital Adoption Program, and that is money to help Canadian companies invest in technology to make themselves more competitive and more productive, especially in moving to an online digital sort of economic world. And there's also a program there to train 28,000 young Canadians to act as advisors to help small and medium-sized enterprises make that transition. On training, there's $960 million over 3 years to work with sector associations, your industry sector associations, to work on training programs to fix labor gaps, another $470 million to boost apprenticeship in the trades, and another $300 million over 3 years to help with skills development. And there's $5.7 billion here over 5 years, Rosie, to help young Canadians. They're going to double grants to low-income students. They're going to extend that until July of 2023, extend student loan interest waivers until March 31st of 2023. There's training programs and hiring. They're going to create 75,000 summer job placements, 7,000 more placements for vulnerable youths in work settings, and they're going to boost internships by about 20,000 positions a year in this budget by giving companies a wage subsidy of up to 75%. So there are specific measures to target those specific areas Mr. O'Toole just mentioned. They just may not be to the flavor, the magnitude, and the style that the Conservative leader is looking for.
Yeah, I would also say that the Conservative leader wants to see tax cuts for families, which of course would be a Conservative idea. Instead of doing that, of course, the Liberals are proposing this $30 billion daycare program over the next 5 years. And someone had told me before the budget, this will take a while to get in place. But the fact that they want to cut people's fees in half
by next year.
By next year, that's money that goes right back into families' pockets. I mean, if you're paying $1,200 a month for daycare and you get half of that, you start to get half of that back. You start to have a lot more disposable income than you might have been used to. Okay, I'll leave both of you just briefly, and I'll go back to Mr. O'Toole, who is taking some questions, so maybe we'll get some clarity around his other concerns.
When you say it's important to provide direct support to parents, should I understand that if you were elected, we would go back to the type of initiative that Mr. Harper brought in 2006? Because at that point, the preference was to give money directly to families. So I guess, would you be doing the same thing if you come to power? Well, what we need is a real program based on an approach that helps all families. As I say, the Liberals have been promising a program like this many times, 3 times in the past. We want to introduce a family that helps all Canadian families, and that's why we're going to be making proposals for the welfare of all Canadian families.
There are no further questions. Il n'y a plus de questions.
Questions in the room now.
Mr. O'Toole, Michelle Boye, CTV News. What do you think about the
All right, that is the leader of the official opposition, Mr. O'Toole. We did, before the budget, ask you what you wanted to see in the budget, what issues are on your mind as we are living through this pandemic. Take a look.
Hi, my name is Erica. My son has been doing distance learning since the onset of COVID. I also lost my position at that time, and I found a few temporary part-time positions to help fill in the gaps. However, it is extremely difficult to work from home and also help your child who is doing distance learning. It is very labor intensive for the parents. It is not as engaging for the children as being in class, and many of us are finding that our children are struggling. We need back our after-school activities, we need back our sports, and our children really need to go back outside and play.
Okay, here is what the government is proposing in their budget this year when it comes to kids and families and childcare. It's $30 billion over the next 5 years to create a national childcare program modeled on the program in Quebec that's $10 a day. In the immediate, because the government knows so many women have been hit so hard by the pandemic, forced out of the workforce, they hope to cut daycare fees in half within a year, as it takes time to, of course, negotiate with provinces and get that kind of system up off the ground. My next guest, Anna K. Brown, is a working mom of 3 kids. Hi, Anna K. Nice to see you.
Hello. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm surprised you even have a minute with 3 kids, and they're all probably at home, Anna K. So tell me what you make of this daycare announcement.
It's long overdue. I think many advocates have been calling for that for the last 10 years, even maybe more. Sure. That we really needed affordable daycare, especially it's affect disproportionately women who are working and don't have childcare. I know that I've been in that position where I still need childcare. I work part-time and I'm not covered to be able to get childcare because I don't have enough hours.
And what do you, would it be okay for me to ask what you pay for childcare or how much it costs you right now?
So I was paying a sitter before the pandemic, and that was on a weekly or every 2-week basis. Depends. It was like maybe $300 every 2 weeks, and that was just because I knew the person. I have other friends who are paying $600 out of their pockets, just because it's still cheaper than daycare, because they're made a little bit over the income level, the lower income level, to be able to truly get a reduced or a subsidized daycare.
And your littlest one is 2, right? I think you've got a 12, a 7, and a 2-year-old, so a pretty busy household. Yeah, at least one would need to be in daycare, and you probably need some after-school care too. So if the government in a year's time could cut those costs in half, what kind of difference would that make to your life?
Tremendous difference. It will make me be more financially independent. My husband does work full-time in the construction industry, but it will also allow me to be able to go out and also provide my own income and be able to work. Also to give my children the ability to be in a place where they can have their own identity, be able to grow, meet new friends, and so forth.
Can I ask you one more question? That's all about daycare, which I know is probably top of mind for most people and for you, but there was also a fair amount of money here to address racialized Canadians, people of color. There's a bunch of money for Black entrepreneurs. How important a moment is it, do you think, for the government to support people right now as they're trying to find their place or refine their footing during the pandemic?
The pandemic has highlighted many things that people have been struggling over the years to bring to address, and also just in being able to invest in diverse and Black community and Indigenous community. And it just broke my heart just a little bit to know that it took the pandemic for us to see it, and also the death of George Floyd for us to be seeing these changes, or for even to start this conversation. I think this pandemic overall just have us where we can no longer have our heads in the sand and pretend like we're not seeing and we're not hearing what's happening in everyday communities in Canada.
Okay, Anna K., there's someone there that needs your attention. I can hear them in the background. But they did pretty well to allow you to talk for that long. Thank you so much for your perspective. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, have a good day. Appreciate it. Stay well.
You too.
Stay well. All right, let me bring in the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapelas, for her thoughts. Vashi.
Hey, Rosie. Yeah, I think, that interview is emblematic of probably what a lot of women who are listening to this budget feel. I think I'm interested. I was just going over, as you were talking to your guest, some of the details around it. It looks like, for example, it comes in at first as like less money that you and I would have to pay, or any Canadian would have to pay for childcare, but not until the end of 2022. And then it morphs into what the government has sort of talked about being a universal childcare program. I'm very curious to see some of the details behind that, for example, which kind of care centers qualify, under what circumstances, and how the negotiations go with the provinces. It looks like it might not be the steepest hill to climb, only because the federal government is bankrolling it to such a grand degree. So if the money is coming, are our provinces going to fight it? Probably not. But some provinces do have certain ways of doing things. And we spoke to Blaine Higgs a few hours ago, who was not too keen on being told how to spend certain amounts of money. So I am curious to see how those negotiations go. And I'm being reminded by many people in the NDP that back in 2015, when Thomas Mulcair was proposing a federal minimum wage and a universal daycare program, there was a lot of criticism for that, not only from the Liberals at the time, but future Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. So certainly they're noting that the tables have turned, and like this guest told you, the last guest told you, and like the government has laid out, this pandemic has certainly made clear a lot of the stuff that maybe wasn't as clear to everyone 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, and just to say, they are promising that $10 a day system, which is what Quebec has. So you would imagine that Quebec would get the money, but not be able to use it for something else. Newfoundland and Labrador, the premier who I spoke to yesterday, they've got a $25 a day program now. So yeah, they would have to figure out and negotiate with each province some sort of system that would work, and that obviously would take some time. Vashi, thank you for that. We will come back to you. Thank you very much. I should tell you that Chrystia Freeland has wrapped up her speech inside the House of Commons. She is going to come and speak to us directly in not very long, and we can ask her some questions about what she's put forward for Canadians today, not only to get you through the pandemic, but to try and help you on the other side too. Okay, lots of issues on your mind throughout all of this, and lots of you are waiting to see what Chrystia Freeland would propose. Here's another issue that you were thinking about.
My name is Kelly Walker-Schobel. I am 42 years old and I live in Vancouver, British Columbia with my husband. I am a communications and marketing executive, and I lost my job in October due to the negative economic impact of the pandemic. We want to have a family, we want to own a home, and yet these goals are feeling increasingly unreachable. I want to see the government in this budget create a comprehensive plan so that all Canadians can afford to own a home.
Okay, I know that lots of people talking about that. My next guest is Preet Banerjee, personal finance expert in Toronto. Preet, good to see you.
Good to see you, Rosie.
So I don't know if what you've looked at, what you've read so far, I imagine bits and pieces. Is there anything in there that could help people who are looking to buy a home and feeling shut out?
You know what? I was surprised that there wasn't a lot in there, because housing has, well, it's always been a topic of national conversation, but it's become parabolic in the last year. And during a pandemic, we've seen house prices rise about 30% across the nation. And so a lot of people, this is no longer a matter of, are we heading into an affordability crisis? We are smack dab in the middle of it. And there weren't a lot of those cooling measures that were expected to be announced that so many people were worried about. So not a lot to address housing in this budget.
Yeah, they may want to see where things land, to be fair, as the real estate bubble continues in a lot of strange places in the country, not in the places you might imagine. They do have a few interesting things, a digital service tax on data and content contributions from Canadian users, a luxury tax if you plan to buy a luxury car or a personal aircraft, not sure how many Canadians are doing that right now, a non-resident property tax that would address some of the issues around real estate, or a vacancy tax. What do you make of those measures, and who, well, we know who they're going after, but what kind of impact they would have?
Right. I don't think these are going to have appreciable impacts in terms of, addressing the debt that has been built up during the pandemic. And when you take a look at that 1% tax on vacant properties owned by foreigners across Canada-wide, so this has been implemented in a few places across Canada. But I think a lot of people will be asking, why does that only apply to foreign ownership? If you have a vacant home and you have a housing crisis, it doesn't matter who owns that vacant home. Yeah. That's kind of a bad thing to have just sitting there when so many people are looking for homes. So I don't know if this is going to be a huge revenue generator. It's certainly not going to bring housing into the realms of affordability for a lot of people for whom it is now out of reach.
Okay, there's $960 million over 3 years for skills training, especially for small and medium-sized businesses. Young people are getting $5.7 billion over 5 years. This is to try and help them get into the workforce and do different things because we know they've been hit hard during the pandemic. What do you make of those investments, particularly targeting young people?
Yeah, so there's a constellation of measures that are targeted towards young people. And what I've noticed is that some people, because there's so many programs, they may not even know that there are programs that they could benefit from. So I've been hearing from a lot of students asking about, well, last year there was that Canada Emergency Student Benefit, and there isn't something for this summer. But I would point out that the Canada Recovery Benefit, you know, if you're 15 and you meet all the qualifications, you could apply for that as well. The expansion of the Canada Summer Jobs Program, it used to be just for summer students, but it's anyone 15 to 30. You don't have to be a student. And that program heavily subsidizes employers for paying the wages of young Canadians. So take a look at these programs, look at the job bank. There are some opportunities, but in terms of anything big, it's more of a constellation of support measures for young people.
Let me just ask you quickly, Preet, the fact that the government's continuing a lot of the supports well past the summer, transforming them into different programs, how important is that for Canadians and for small businesses right now?
Very important to have some level of certainty. So whereas last year everything was coming fast and furious, it's good to have some level of certainty in a world which is filled with uncertainty, especially with the different health restrictions and lockdowns. And it feels like we are approaching the end of that tunnel with the vaccinations, and we've seen the tapering off of some of these support programs announced as well. So it feels like we're getting there, but it also feels like it's a long way away.
Yeah, it is. Preet, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here and your perspective today. Thank you. I'm going to take you now, viewers, to the leader of the Bloc Québécois, Yves-François Blanchet, who is speaking now. And let's get some of his reaction to the budget.
Mais le Canada a cette capacité d'emprunt dans un contexte de dépenses ponctuelles plutôt que structurelles. Le gouvernement a été à l'écoute d'un certain nombre de demandes, a saisi un certain nombre d'opportunités qui viennent de plusieurs milieux, qui viennent notamment de demandes assez insistantes du Bloc québécois, notamment dans le secteur aéronautique,
in the aeronautics sector, in the pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical industry, measures for transport, electrification, and even bioforestry. There are a number of other examples as well. And there are questions we will have to have answered. Where will that money be spent? Because, of course, when we're talking about aeronautics or bioforestry or electrification of transportation, we're talking about sectors that are first and foremost areas where there is a huge amount of expertise in Quebec. So where will the money go, and will it be enough? And quite sincerely, we can't tell you that right now. Now, with respect to childcare, there we're talking about a significant investment being made by the federal government. The program has obviously taken inspiration in an area where Quebec has been extremely innovative. Ms. Marois was the first to bring in a program of this nature. And of course, I understand that Quebec will receive its share of the federal investments, but I would not understand that someone who uses the Quebec program as an inspiration would want to impose standards on Quebec. So what we're talking about here is an annual transfer to Quebec of a significant amount of money and nothing more. Now, in terms of the long-term care homes, there again, we do not feel imposing conditions on Quebec is acceptable. Now, you won't be surprised to hear me see this. This particular pandemic is a health issue, and it primarily harmed seniors, our parents, our grandparents. And Everything the budget doesn't contain is health transfers. It's not that there are fewer, there aren't any.
Okay, that is Yves-François Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, giving his initial thoughts about this budget, talking particularly, and this is an ongoing demand from the province of Quebec, about how there are not significant increases to healthcare transfers, which is what provinces have been asking for. The government needs the support of just one party in order to survive. Let's say goodbye to our viewers on the Maritimes on CBC Television. Special coverage continues on CBC News Network and CBC Gem. Okay, hello again. I'm Rosemary Barton here in the foyer of the West Bloc, just outside the House of Commons. We are standing by for reaction from opposition leaders to this year's budget, the first from Chrystia Freeland, the first from a woman, from a female finance minister, and the first budget we have seen in 2 years, because we didn't get one after the last election, and the pandemic has really caused an awful lot of economic upheaval in this country. Let's bring back my colleagues, Vashi Kapelis and David Cochran, to talk more about what is in this budget. Vashi, where do you want to go next?
Well, I was just listening to the Bloc leader, very curious to hear how all opposition parties are kind of positioning themselves, just because in the lead up to this budget, none of them, particularly the Bloc and the NDP, well, the NDP was explicit, but the Bloc didn't seem as though there was a huge appetite to oppose it. So kind of listening to them to hear if there are certain things in there that are particularly egregious. The Bloc leader talking about some of the money that would be transferred, it sounded like in lieu of childcare, and David might know more of the details on this, in lieu of the childcare program, since this one is essentially going to be on a countrywide basis modeled after the program that's already in effect in Quebec, and how there shouldn't be strings attached to that. And then also highlighting, for example, some money that's being directed to long-term care in the name of helping provinces meet and I guess, reach certain long-term care standards. And that has been something that the government promised after the first wave, which we saw, and subsequently the second wave, ravaged long-term care homes so severely. This idea of national standards, we don't know what they look like at this point. There has been some opposition from certain provinces, especially Quebec, to that idea. And so will this money help assuage that? Or in the case of the Bloc leader, is that a point of contention? And really big picture, when it comes to these points of contention for each of the opposition leaders, is it enough for them to oppose the budget as a whole? Or are there things in there that mitigate sort of some of that opposition? In the case of the Bloc leader, for example, it would be I think it's about $12 billion. Again, David, correct me if I'm wrong, for seniors, something that he had asked very specifically for. I know we're still waiting for Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, and Annamie Paul, the leader of the Green Party, but we seem to have some indications of where each of the parties are sitting in response to what the government's announced today.
Okay, thanks for that, Vashi. I'm not sure if people could hear someone going, hey, as they walk by. That was the finance minister on her way over to her office saying hello. And she will be joining us just after the top of the hour to answer some of our questions. In the meantime, let's go back to David. David, and let's just do a recap of sort of the big picture of what they've put on the table today and where we are at.
Yeah, it's a massive budget, and I'm going to go through some of the highlights. Obviously, I can't go through everything because there's just too much there. But as we say, this is an historic budget in a couple of senses, and it's the first one in 2 years. It's the first one by a female finance minister, and the first one delivered by a working mother, and she has put a lot of effort into creating a national childcare and early learning program. There's $30 billion for that over the next 5 years, and then annual spending of $8.3 billion to sustain it. That's on top of existing funding already there. The goal in the short term is to cut fees for parents outside of Quebec by 50% by as soon as next year, and then by 2025 across the country, fees for childcare and early learning will be at $10 a day. They say this will unleash the economic potential for moms across the country in particular, maybe adding 1.2% to the GDP. That's for next year and the years after. In the immediate here and now, they have to deal with the pandemic. So on that front, there's an extension of the key pandemic supports that have really helped keep a lot of businesses as much afloat as they can throughout this pandemic. They're extending the wage subsidy, the rent subsidy, and the extra lockdown top-ups until at least September. The Canada Recovery Benefit, which gives $500 a week to people who lose their jobs and need money, your eligibility is extended by 12 weeks. 4 weeks at $500, 8 weeks at $300. They want, as vaccinations improve, to create an incentive for people to go back to work, which leads to this next program, a new program they're creating, $600 million, $595 for the Canada Recovery Hiring Program. This will give direct wage subsidies, payroll subsidies to companies for new hiring, not the jobs they've kept afloat during the pandemic, but for new hiring or the increasing in hours. Now, once we get through the COVID crisis, onto the climate crisis. There's a lot of money in this budget, either through direct spending or tax incentives to try to make Canada's emissions targets more ambitious. $5 billion over 7 years to the Net Zero Accelerator to try to lead innovation that will help lead towards net zero emissions by 2050. They're offering a tax cut on corporate tax rates and small and medium-sized business tax rates for manufacturers who make net zero technologies. Think things like car charging stations or batteries or solar panels or wind turbines. Tax cuts to encourage innovation in that fund. There's $4.4 million over 5 years for home retrofits. A lot of that, Rosie, will be done through interest-free loans through the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, allowing people to get loans of up to $40,000 to make their home more energy efficient. You can put in insulation. You can replace your furnace. You can get rid of drafty windows and doors. Money to make that happen, and also create jobs through increased house renovation activity. That and a series of other measures leads to a more ambitious 2030 emissions reduction target of 36% below 2005 numbers instead of the earlier 30% reduction. All of this comes with an enormous financial cost. There's no other way to describe it. The deficit for the year just ended, the 2020-2021 fiscal year, which was hopefully the worst year we're going to face, deficit of $354 billion, $155 billion this year. Then you can see as the pandemic support programs start to wind down and economic activity returns to normal, the deficits tick all the way down to about $31 billion by 2025-26. That's the kind of number we were talking about before anyone ever heard of COVID-19. Obviously, the planned fiscal track has been thrown off by all of this. The debt of the country from before the pandemic to that target date will double to about $1.4 trillion. But the argument from the government is that all of that spending, all of that debt, all of it is necessary because of the toll on some of the more disadvantaged members of Canadian society. We've seen childcare primarily targeting women who lost their jobs. We're seeing a long-demanded commitment from people like the NDP for a 15-hour federal minimum wage, or if your provincial minimum wage is higher, that one will stand. That's also going to be indexed to the cost of living, and that should mean a pay increase for about 26,000 people. There's $8.9 billion over 6 years to expand the Canada Workers' Benefit. That is a tax credit, tax rebate for low-income working individuals and low-income working families. Is about $1,400 for a childless individual, $2,400 for a family. The government says that will lift about 100,000 Canadians out of poverty. And then a promise for seniors that has been long overdue. A 10% increase in old age security coming into force next year with a $500 one-time payment this year to sort of bridge towards that more permanent increase. Rosie, there's also billions here for training programs for youth in terms of interest deferral and grants for students. There's money for Indigenous Canadians, for small businesses. There is a lot of money here that checks a lot of boxes because, it's the first budget since the last election. It's the last one before the likely next election. So don't think that didn't play a role in the creation of this financial program.
For sure. Couple of things there. I would just remind Canadians that there is a climate change summit hosted by President Biden later this week, and we knew that the government wanted to come up with some big numbers, so that 30 rising the target up to 36% rather than 30% is significant. It also then, of course, puts puts Aaron O'Toole, who's promised to get to a reduction of 30% himself, puts some pressure on him to look at whether that climate change plan is ambitious enough, I suppose. There's also some things that are perhaps not in the budget, David, and I wonder if you want to mention a couple of those.
Yeah, two big things right off the bat, and one of these the New Democrats will definitely jump on. There's nothing here for pharmacare. They want to continue momentum on pharmacare. This was a sort of a surprise insertion in the 2019 budget. It was a central part, or not a central part, but a pretty big part of delivering Liberals' election campaign last time. There's nothing for that in this budget. Now, a lot of the new spending that's in here, they're framing up as an economic investment. Childcare is expensive, but it unleashes economic potential. Pharmacare, you talk to government officials over the past year, that becomes a straight entitlement. There's no necessarily economic boost coming from moving people off, say, a private sector drug plan to a public sector drug plan. And there's also really inconsistent buy-in on this across the country. So no movement there. I would expect Jagmeet Singh will criticize him for this quite significantly. The other thing not there, health transfers. The premiers want $28 billion extra a year every year. That is not there. There is $3 billion over 5 years for long-term care to improve standards there. But there is not that permanent structural increase in healthcare spending that the first ministers have been demanding from the Prime Minister.
Although the Prime Minister said, don't hold your breath, it's not coming. But I'll come back to both of you. Let's go back now to the Bloc leader, because he is talking a little bit about that and not pleased that there is not more money for healthcare. The leader of the Bloc Québécois, Yves-François Blanchet.
We're talking about sectors such as aeronautics, pharmaceuticals, electrification of transportation. These are Quebec specialties. These are flagship industries there. So if we're talking about key sectors in Quebec, we don't want to see them being shifted to Ontario. Now, there could end up being an imbalance, and that's why it's not a matter of whether it's too much or not enough. It depends on how it's going to be spent, where it's going to be spent, but obviously Canada's ability to deal with that debt over the long term is quite clear.
Hi, David Thurton, CBC News. Bonsoir, Mr. Blanchet. So can you just tell us, what position are you taking? Is this something that you can support? Is this something that you're prepared to vote against?
There are things in that budget which can only please to a listener from Quebec, because when we speak about pharmaceutics, or when we speak about aeronautics, or when we speak about electrification of transportation or forests, those are sectors of the economy which are very important in Quebec, in which we are very innovative and have been for a long time. So there are some good things in that budget. But there's this point. Our parents and grandparents have been completely left aside in that budget. The government will have a deficit which will go up to $150 billion without caring enough to provide a significant support to the elders, and without answering positively a request from all and each of the prime ministers in Canada about a transfer for health care. And I cannot so far explain myself why he could get to that conclusion.
And so are those things that are absent from...
All right, that is Yves-François Blanchet. We arrived just in time to hear him a little bit in English there, and as we expected, talking about the fact that the massive healthcare transfer boost that premiers have talked to the federal government about is not in the budget. Should point out that the Prime Minister has said he's willing to have a conversation, but not now, and certainly not during the pandemic. Would also point out that when it comes to seniors in the country, the budget does now promise $3 billion over 5 years for long-term care, although that too would have to be negotiated with the provinces, and there could as well be conditions, which would be problematic, undoubtedly, for some provinces. All right, as we dig more into this pandemic budget, a budget that seeks to not only get you through the crisis, this third wave that many of you are experiencing, but also to try and support you on the other side of it. We asked some of you, what's something's on your mind? What's something you're going to be looking for today? Here's another look.
Hi, this is Chief Eric Redhead, Shamattawa First Nation. In northern Manitoba, we faced one of the worst outbreaks in the country of COVID-19 based on population, but we've managed to get through that with the help of the men and women who serve in the Canadian Armed Forces. What I'd like to see in this first budget in 2 years is investment in the economy, investment in clean water, investment in infrastructure, investment in housing, investment in education.
All right, my next guest is Natan Obed. He's president of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. Nice to see you. Let me get a sense from you, Natan, about what you make of the spending that's promised to Indigenous communities in this country. $18 billion over the next 5 years for infrastructure, for supporting communities. Obviously, some of that would include Canada's Inuit. What do you make of the promises here?
Thanks, Rosie. We've had a few years now with this government about what this particular budget might look like. It's great to see infrastructure dollars. It's great to see food insecurity dollars, childcare, language. There's a number of things that look very good, but there's not a lot of distinctions-based focus in the exact dollar amounts. There's a lot of terminology that's around Indigenous, but for the most part, all of that now is going to be up to departments, up to the conversations that we have moving forward about what this actually means.
And by that you mean, of course, that it is not targeting Inuit, Métis, or First Nations. It's just sort of a lump sum of money towards Indigenous peoples.
Correct. And historically, Indigenous or the precursors to that particular name meant funding for First Nations on reserve, because the federal government has very specific obligations under the Indian Act for that particular group of Indigenous people in this country. We have been really pushing for distinctions-based language and also specific carve-outs for either projects or for the specific funds within an Indigenous space. And this gets us 2 steps out of 3 steps. It's great to see Indigenous investment and significant Indigenous investment. It now is going to be, what does this actually mean for Inuit? Yes. And there are more questions than answers in this particular budget.
Let me ask you about one measure that struck me, only because the story also struck me. It's $126 million over 3 years to foster healthcare systems free from racism and discrimination. This, of course, in the wake of the death of Joyce Echaquan and the creation of Joyce's Principle, which is supposed to try and bring a healthcare system that is not discriminatory. How significant is that to Inuit people right now, do you think, that they can have trust in the healthcare system, knowing that things like this have happened?
I hope that that money is spent on upholding our human rights. I hope that this goes beyond just this idea that with a little bit more training and cross-cultural awareness that healthcare systems are going to cease to be inherently racist. There are very clear levers that should be put into place, starting with the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples legislation and the creation of an action plan. And this is scattered throughout the budget, but really when we're talking about racism and confronting racism, we're basically talking about upholding Indigenous peoples' human rights.
Okay, Natan Obed, always good to see you. Thank you for making the time, I appreciate it.
Yeah, great to see you too.
Okay, stay well. All right, let's go back to David Cochrane to talk to him more about what is in the budget. We're going to speak to the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, shortly. If you've got any questions for her, David, you just let me know. I guess one of my questions for you would be, okay, if we get through this without an election, and it's not clear to me yet whether that's the case, although I suspect it is, given the state of the pandemic in this country right now, is this a document that the government can safely campaign on? Will there have to be more, do you get the sense that this is sort of an election budget, even if it's not now?
Yeah, there's kind of 3 big themes are hitting on here, right? There's COVID and the supports to get us to the other side of it as a country, upon which they will ultimately be judged on everything from the pandemic supports to the control of the borders to the distribution and procurement of vaccines. There is this giant childcare promise, which of course will require some cooperation and negotiations with provinces who are hoping for big healthcare money that they did not get. And then, of course, there is their commitment on climate. There's a lot of stuff there to help move towards that 2030 target and then the 2050 net zero that seeks to sort of transform a lot of what we do in Canada economically. It's not these gigantic great reset sort of conspiracies that were being thrown around leading into this, but it is the use of tax credits in particular to encourage companies to invest in things like carbon capture technology, to invest in green energy, or to set up a company that makes the things that can help the country move towards a lower emissions economic output by cutting corporate taxes by as much as 50% between now and 2030, with it going down over time, to encourage that sort of investment. Also, there's like $9 billion to set up a rare minerals program for car batteries here in the country. This is something they're working with the United States on, right? To sort of take the auto industry that exists in the two countries and transform it into an electronic vehicle manufacturing monster is where they want to go with this. So, you know, if you look at those three things, COVID, childcare, climate, and then the sprinkling of other supports that are acutely important to the specific groups that are targeted by this, like an increase in old age security, summer jobs for youth with an increased moratorium on their student loan payments, and the doubling of student grants for low-income Canadians. There's a lot there they can put in the window, but you mentioned you wanted a question for the finance minister. In a budget with this much spending, why is there nothing for pharmacare? That's a question I'd like to know, because if you can't do it in this budget, you're probably not going to do it at all. And I think that's probably the conclusion a lot of the critics of the government are going to draw from this, that they've kind of picked childcare because of the economic lift and the equity lift rather than pharmacare because it's simply money out the door.
Okay, David Cochrane, thank you for that. Appreciate it, listening in. My next guest, the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, who joins us safely from probably her office now. Hi, Minister Freeland, nice of you to make the time.
Hi, Rosie, nice to see you.
I know David wants me to ask about pharmacare, but I'm going to start somewhere else. We know that the economy is doing perhaps better than we expected in the midst of all of this. Can you explain to Canadians why then you need to spend $101 billion over the next 3 years?
Yes, I can, Rosie. And let me start by saying we are 460,000 jobs short of where we need to be to just return to the pre-pandemic employment levels. That is a lot of jobs. It's nearly the gap that we got to at the depth of the 2009 recession. And for me, getting Canadians back to work is urgent. I don't want people to have to wait 10 years, which is how long it took for us to return after 2009 to the labor force participation levels we had in 2009. So my first and most important answer is Canadians need jobs. They need to get back to work. This budget is going to do that.
You talk a lot about the 2009, the recovery in 2009, and how the world has to learn lessons from what happened after that and in relation to stimulus. What happened in 2009 that you are trying to avoid here? What is it that you're trying to get away from in terms of the recovery?
Two things. The recovery was too slow around the world, in the rich countries around the world, and people pulled back support too soon. And I have to say, conversations that I had, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, at the World Bank IMF spring meetings with people like Janet Yellen, the US Secretary of the Treasury, with Olaf Scholz, the German finance minister, really reinforced my conviction that the world did not respond fast enough and hard enough to the 2009 recession. We let economic hardship fester, and that had not only terrible economic consequences, leading, to subpar economic performance, it had really devastating social and, in many countries, political consequences.
I'll ask you a couple more questions. One on childcare, if I can. You want to set this up with the provinces. You've got a bit of time to do that. But as you well know, this is a promise Liberals have made before and let down Canadians by not getting there. So how do you get provinces on board? How do you negotiate with them? I imagine bankrolling all of the program will help.
Yeah, two things, Rosie. First of all, we understand this costs a lot of money. And so that's why we are putting real money on the table. $30 billion over 5 years. And then, we have been careful about the new permanent spending we're committing to, but we are committing to permanent spending on early learning and childcare. I think that's something that the provinces and territories would quite rightly expect, and it is there. And the second thing is, Rosie, and I'll be interested in your view on this, but my view very strongly is COVID has opened a lot of people's eyes to the importance of early learning and childcare. And people we've seen the reality that when you do not have childcare available, women drop out of the labor force. That's what has happened in this COVID year. And that has a really, really negative economic impact. So I am hopeful that there's been a bit of a political epiphany in Canada, and I'm going to put my shoulder to the wheel. I really believe now is the moment to get this done.
Pharmacare, as per David's question, this is something you campaigned on. Again, this is something Liberals have talked about, mused about doing. It seemed like in the last election this was important, and yet it's not in the budget. So what should Canadians make of that?
Well, we have taken some important foundational steps towards pharmacare, and the budget continues with those measures, especially on drugs for rare diseases. And in the budget text, we say that we are open to conversations with willing partners in provinces and territories to keep the ball moving forward.
That doesn't sound like it's on the horizon anytime soon. Is it fair to say that the pandemic has pushed that to the back burner because there are more urgent needs?
No, I wouldn't say that, Rosie, but I would say on healthcare overall, we recognize right now that everyone in Canada working on healthcare is urgently focused on conquering COVID. We put $5 billion more. We contributed to provinces last month because we know how urgent that fight is. And sure enough, the third wave is here. But we recognize that right now, the wolf is at the door when it comes to our healthcare challenges. And we think that the right thing to do for all of us is to be addressing that challenge. And we know there are more conversations to be had on healthcare.
Finally, let me just ask about the deficit. Canadians have become used to really huge numbers through this pandemic. But when we think what was normal before for a deficit versus what we have now, $354 billion, do you lose any sleep over that? That's a huge amount of money that we cannot keep going. And I realize some of it will come back through the recovery, but does that concern you that the deficit is so high?
Rosie, I lose sleep over every aspect of the budget and the Canadian economy. While we were putting this together, I had a little notepad beside my bed so I could wake up in the middle of the night and write down new worries. So yeah, I worry about everything. But when it comes to debt and deficits, I want to say a couple of reassuring things to Canadians. First of all, we are careful in our forecasting. And people have a real proof point on that because we forecast a deficit for 2021 of $381.6 billion. It turns out that for 2021, our deficit is $354.2 billion. And that's actually lower than what the PBO forecast. So we have sharp pencils here in the Department of Finance, and we're careful about things. And then the second thing, and this is really important, is when it comes to going forward, we believe there's a crisis right now, and we believe that requires extraordinary measures, and that's why we've put them in place. But this is a plan for jobs and growth. It's a prudent and reasonable plan. Over the forecast horizon, the debt to GDP ratio falls. It does a little curve like this on your graph. It goes downward. It ends up at 49.2%, and the deficit in 25-26 is 1.1%. So this is reasonable. It's sustainable. And if it reassures Canadians to know I worry about everything, I do.
Okay, Minister Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, thank you on your first budget. Thanks for making the time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, we are also getting some reaction from another opposition leader, this time the leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh. Here's what he had to say just moments ago. Take a listen.
One of the most difficult years that Canadians have seen in a lifetime, in a generation, where people lost their jobs, people lost their businesses, and people lost their lives. Canadians are looking in this budget for an answer to the question, who's going to pay for the recovery? Who's going to pay for the cost of this pandemic? And the Liberals have answered very clearly that it will not be the ultra-rich. They have not put in any significant measures to address the fact that the ultra-rich in Canada have seen not just profits, not just getting by, but record profits in this pandemic. That companies like Amazon have significantly increased their wealth, that web giants have seen their wealth increase, that the richest billionaires in Canada have seen their wealth also increase. There's no measure in this budget to say that it should be the ultra rich who pay their fair share. It's the ultra rich who should pay for the pandemic. And in rejecting any measure to make the ultra rich pay, what Justin Trudeau is saying is that workers and families are going to have to pay the price. Families that can't afford medication are going to continue to suffer because Justin Trudeau has abandoned pharmacare. Workers that are worried about going to work sick and don't have paid sick leave, again, are going to have to continue to bear the burden because there's no improvements to that. We've seen again and again that this government has chosen to let the ultra-rich off the hook while families continue to struggle and are going to have to continue to pay the price. We believe there is a better way, and that is to put in place a tax on the ultra-rich to make sure they're contributing their fair share, and we invest in people. And while there's some good announcements, our other concern is that the Liberals like to say the right thing, but then they don't follow through on it. Justin Trudeau says one thing and does another. Pharmacare was something he campaigned on. He introduced in a throne speech, and now in this budget is completely abandoned. What's to say that he won't do the same thing with childcare? That's our concern. So we're going to continue to fight to get help to people, and Canadians can rest assured we will continue to fight for them. Donc, après un an qui était un des plus difficiles, un dur
one of the most difficult years we've lived through, when people lost their jobs and small businesses shut down, and many people lost their lives. I mean, it was a very difficult year, and the big issue is who will pay the bill for the recovery and for the pandemic. And the Liberals gave us an answer in this budget. They have clearly stated that it will not be the ultra-rich paying their fair share. And by saying that, Liberals under Justin Trudeau are basically saying that it's going to be workers who continue to pay the bill. Families who need drugs but can't afford to buy them, they too will continue to pay the price because the Liberals rejected universal pharmacare that would be fully public. So workers who need an improved sick day program are also disappointed because there again, the Liberals rejected the idea of improving the paid sick leave program. So the critical issue here is who's going to pay the bill for the recovery, and the Liberals responded saying that it won't be the ultra-rich. It will be the workers of this country. We believe that is a mistake. It's a poor choice being made by the Liberals. We think we have to ensure that the ultra-rich pay their share and web giants have to pay their fair share, and we will continue to fight for people and for families. And finally, the Liberals did say something positive, but we've often heard the Liberals say one thing and do something different. Justin Trudeau has often done that. So,
okay, and that is NDP leader Jagmeet Singh giving his initial thoughts on the budget, not surprisingly, talking about what we just asked the finance minister there, the lack of really a push for a pharmacare program that had been promised in the last election. The finance minister says it's still something they're willing to discuss with provinces. I'll bring in my colleague, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapelos, to talk a little bit more about what we heard there from Jagmeet Singh. Some things not exactly as they appear, I would say. He talked about the fact there's no paid sick leave. In fact, there is a promise for paid sick leave, $30 billion over 5 years. He seems to welcome the daycare news there too, Vashi.
Yes, he seemed to welcome the daycare news. What he was pointing out, as you mentioned, that isn't in there, two specific things that his party had been calling for a number of months, actually, but most especially in the past few weeks. Pharmacare, Not in there. I heard your answer or your question and answer with the finance minister. Certainly didn't seem, I had the same interpretation as you. Didn't seem like it was around the corner anytime soon. And then the other one is the NDP had been proposing, they actually introduced a motion months ago around a wealth tax that targeted families with a wealth of $20 million or more, but also targeted companies which have continued to profit at a very high rate during the pandemic. And so he was pointing out that there wasn't that in this budget. There are luxury taxes, for example, on cars and boats, though, in this. There's also digital taxes. There just doesn't seem to be sort of a big extra tax like the one that the NDP is proposing in this budget at all. So he expressed some disappointment there. I am curious to see. I highly doubt that that's enough to change the stance that he's taken in the lead up to this budget, which is that they would support it because it is in the middle of a pandemic and they don't want to trigger an election in the middle of the third wave. So I highly doubt that that's changed anything, because also when it comes to pharmacare and the wealth tax, the Liberals certainly hadn't indicated in the lead up to this budget that would be in there, unlike childcare, which they had strongly signaled rather would be in there.
Yeah, and I should point out to everybody that you're going to continue coverage once we're off the air from 6 until 8, and you'll probably talk to Mr. Singh and I imagine others, right? And you can try, and we'll get some clarity on where they stand in terms of their support of the budget. Thank you so much for that, Vashi. Appreciate it. Just one point of clarification on my part. Well, actually, it's a point of clarification from the government. Jonathan Wilkinson, the Minister of the Environment's office, is making it clear that the 36% of new targets for emissions is not actually what will be announced at the climate summit later this week with President Biden. In fact, it will be more. So the 36% seems to be the new floor rather than the new target. I guess we'll hear more at that summit. Okay, we're going to take a short break, a very short one, but when we come back, we'll talk to At Issue. They'll join us live for their take on this budget, this first pandemic budget. Look at them all, ready to go with their thoughts right after this. Talk in a minute. Hi, welcome back. I'm Rosemary Barton here in the foyer of the West Bloc in the House of Commons as we've been digging into this budget, the first budget in some time, and the first budget for this Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland. And it's also time for At Issue, who will bring us their first take on it. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj. They'll all join me later on the Nationals too, but we don't want to wait to hear what you make of it. Let's just start with that, your initial thoughts, Chantal.
No big surprises in the sense that a lot of this had been advertised. If you believe that what is clear can be said concisely, then, 270 plus measures and what is it, 800 pages, but does not quite fit the bill. It does fit the bill of an election platform where there's everything for everyone. I'm curious to see where because the big ticket item is the Childcare initiative. I'm curious to see where that goes, because you do realize that not a penny gets out the door unless there is provincial buy-in. I can see some provinces buying in, BC for instance, but I don't think that this plan will really lift off the ground before Canadians go back to the polls, and that is not a prediction for a June election. But it is a prediction that there will not be deals struck with any province that create childcare places anytime soon. And I'm also struck by the fact that if you read the NDP platform in 2015, Thomas Mulcair's platform, you would believe that it has been a big inspiration for this, both on childcare and on the minimum wage, $15.
Yeah, and that's one thing that the NDP hates more than anything, seeing some of their ideas borrowed or stolen away by the Liberals. Andrew, your thoughts on what we've seen today?
Yeah, well, it has spending that would dwarf anything Thomas Mulcair ever dreamed of. This is grotesquely irresponsible, frankly. They are spending even more than they had pledged to spend before, with even less justification. If you look at the numbers, they're spending $20 billion a year long after the recession is over, $20 billion a year more than they projected in the fall economic statement, $50 billion a year more than they projected in the budget 2 years ago. At the time of the fall economic statement, they were still talking about stimulus because the economy was going to be growing slowly. It is now clear that it is not. That's why the deficit numbers are down in the last year by $30 billion. What the minister didn't mention is that the deficit numbers are $30 billion over what she projected for the year just started, because they're spending all this money not on stimulus anymore. They've simply repurposed it to spend on all kinds of other programs, social infrastructure, which may be wonderful programs, but not if they're borrowing to pay for them. So they can talk about all the other things they want to do besides economic growth, but it's economic growth that pays the bills. And there's virtually nothing in this budget that would really promises substantial increases in long-term economic growth. To give you an example, the centerpiece daycare proposal on the government's own numbers would raise economic growth per year by 0.05 percentage points, 1/20th of 1 percentage point. That is not going to dig us out of the fiscal hole that we are in now.
Okay. Althea, your thoughts, and then I'll come back for one more round.
Oh, so many things. I think I agree with Chantal. I think this is an election budget that proves, frankly, that an election is not needed. She mentioned the $15 minimum wage for federal workers, which is the promise that was in the 2019 NDP platform as well. The Liberals have stolen that. The NDP had promised $1 billion for childcare. The Liberals have bested that by announcing a $30 billion plan over 5 years and $8.9 billion going forward. They've stolen a conservative idea to have a 3-digit suicide line that Erin O'Toole had announced just at the party convention, saying we're already working on it. O'Toole announced on Friday that the climate targets for Paris were going to be met. Then the Liberals announced in this budget that it's going to be 36%. So the yardstick has shifted. The Bloc had wanted more money for old age security. The Liberals are announcing $3 billion increase year over year to ensure a 10% boost for seniors over 75, and handily a $500 check just in August in time for potentially another campaign. I mean, so if you could look at this budget and say, well, why do they need to have a campaign? They all seem to be working well together by spending each other's ideas and putting it in this budget.
Yes.
The other thing I think that's important to mention is there is no fiscal anchor to this budget at all. There is no reason why they couldn't have chosen one, but there is one anchor, and that is Chrystia Freeland is basically pledging her entire credibility on getting childcare done. She repeats this, and she repeated this in her speech in the House of Commons. She repeats it in the foreword of the budget, that as the first female finance minister, as a working mother, she promises to get childcare done. And yet the details are so vague, 50-50 split between provinces and the federal government. I can't see the provinces who are basically broke agreeing to that, but it might be a negotiating starting point.
Oh, okay, so if the budget was supposed to sort of deal with the place where we are, which is pretty bad in large parts of the country, and then talk about what the future would be, does it do a good job of balancing those two components? And where does that sort of lead them politically, Chantal?
Up to a point, it does a decent job of that, in the sense that they have walked away from this idea that we're reinventing the world thanks to the pandemic, which is a sane thing to do. On childcare, I don't disagree with Althea, but let's agree that this will be a test of Chrystia Freeland leadership candidate rather than finance minister anytime soon, because this is not. And it's normal that all of the details are up in the air, because you do have to have negotiations with every province on this. That is what it is tailored to. Where does it leave them politically? Seriously, in a place where no opposition party wants to go on a campaign against them on it.
Okay, Andrew, same question to you.
I think the opposition can campaign against them on the daycare, and I would encourage them to do so. We had something of this fight in 2006. Is it better to send money to the provinces to then hand out to daycare centers, or is it better to send it to parents so that they can choose where they want to send their money or send public funds? The only people who benefit from this program are the ones who choose to send their children to those particular types of daycare centers, and then only if they get over the provincial objections, which are going to be massive. As Althea mentioned, the provinces are broke. Take all the federal debt to GDP ratio numbers that we're talking about and double them, because you've got the provinces who are in as bad or worse shape themselves, with much less access to, the Bank of Canada, et cetera. So even to be talking about this kind of massive expansion of the federal welfare state, more or less at the expense of the provinces, I think is a really controversial idea. And if the opposition has their wits about them, they will tackle them on this.
One more
and just a point here, Andrew probably only means the Conservatives, because this is an NDP platform plank. The Bloc is not going to be campaigning against childcare when it is the most popular social program in Quebec. So if the Conservatives want to go after that, good luck to them. But I predict that the government in BC will buy in. Some Atlantic Canada governments will also, and maybe Premier Ford.
Maybe, if he needs some help right now. Last thought to you, Althea.
Well, I don't think the Conservatives are going to campaign against childcare. I mean, when you look, there's a chart in the budget that goes through what the median the median cost of toddler care is across the country, and basically every city above $1,000 a month, except for Calgary, is a swing riding, a highly contested riding, and most of the ones that have the highest cost are all around Toronto and the GTA. There is no way the Conservatives are campaigning against this. And frankly, there is nothing in this budget for the opposition parties to vote against. It is even hard to see. There's no great big plan, frankly, in this budget either, for the Liberals to, I think, convincingly argue that they need to go to the Governor Generals and ask for an election on this. It is not a ground-changing budget. It is a big spending budget, but there is nothing to engineer a campaign in this.
Although that's what you could defeat them on is the big spending, is it not, Andrew?
Well, the Conservatives, it's not just the big spending. The Conservatives don't have to campaign against childcare. They can campaign on their own plan, which is send the money to the parents rather than to the provinces. That is a perfectly tenable thing, and in fact was a winning proposition in elections past. So there's no reason they can't campaign on that. In fact, that would be better public policy.
Which the Liberals are still doing, right? They're still keeping the Canada Child Benefit, which is actually costing them more than this new childcare plan.
Chantal, last word, Chantal.
It was also a winning proposition in 2006 and beyond to campaign against the carbon tax. Just saying.
Okay. She likes to get the last word, as we all know. I won't let her do it later on the national.
yes.
I won't let her do it on the national. Okay, we'll talk to you all later on the national. Thank you, Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. Let me bring back the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapellas, who will be much easier to wrangle than them. What are you hearing in terms of reaction from premiers, Vashi, from Western Canada?
Yeah, for sure. Well, we'll start out in Alberta, where the primary ask of the federal government in the lead up to this budget was actually very specific to carbon capture technology. The government in Alberta and supported by the government in Saskatchewan as well, had been calling for something like a $30 billion investment in that technology in order to help those provinces contribute to Canada's overall goal, for example, of net zero by 2050. It looks like there's not a line in there for $30 billion, but there is a tax credit. I'm not exactly certain how it will work, but the people I'm speaking to in the Premier's office are encouraged by that sign. So far, no major reaction from out west talking about how, as has been the case in the past, that they are sort of isolated or left out of what's in this budget for Canadians. And then as far as other premiers go, I've been trying to ascertain where they sit on the childcare program, especially, and how much buy-in there is. It looks like there's some confusion, for example, in Newfoundland and Labrador and in BC and in Quebec about provinces that already have some kind of subsidized childcare and how this will work with that. Does it mean they just get a big chunk of money and they can spend it on what they want, which is what they're hoping for? And as far as other provinces, lots of them saying that they just want to get some idea of the finer details before deciding how they buy in, to what degree, how those conversations work. It doesn't look like those conversations at this point have taken place so far. Somewhat understandable to a degree. It's a huge program they're announcing, so might be necessary to find out who supports it. But also, right now, provincial federal discussions have been consumed by the pandemic, which kind of makes sense.
Of course. Okay, Vashi Kapellas, thank you for help throughout this coverage. Vashi will have 2 more hours of post-budget analysis for us, which will start at 6 p.m. Eastern on CBC News Network and CBC Gem. Thanks, Vashi. Appreciate it. As always, let's bring in some reaction now from Green Party leader Annamie Paul. Here's what she had to say on the budget.
We have just received I have just had the opportunity to review the budget and to listen to Minister Freeland just minutes ago. I'm going to be focusing at this moment on the parts of the budget that relate to the pandemic and the COVID response for 2 reasons. First, we are in this devastating 3rd wave of the pandemic. It's a moment where thoughts of people in Canada are on how they'll get through this, and the thoughts of our elected officials across all parties should also be on how we can work together, as we did in the early days of the pandemic, to make sure that people can get through the pandemic as well as possible, as intact as possible. So that's one reason. And then the second reason that I'd like to focus my comments on the pandemic and our response to it as contained in the budget is because I will be very, very honest and say that I do not have a lot of confidence that this session of Parliament will be around long enough to implement many of the promises that we heard in the budget today. Many of the commitments were multi-year commitments, some of which didn't begin until 2022 or 2023. And given the fragility of this Parliament, given the unfortunate turn back to partisanship, back to partisan posturing, I don't have a lot of confidence that at this moment that this Parliament will last long enough to see the most ambitious of the promises presented in the budget fulfilled. I certainly hope that that's not the case, and the Green Party of Canada stands at the ready to work in collaboration and cooperation across party lines to make this an historic session of Parliament, one that delivers on our true promise to complete our social safety net, to launch a green recovery to the pandemic, and to create and forge a more just society.
All right, that is some reaction from Annamie Paul, Green Party leader. She's yet to win a seat here in the House of Commons, plans to run in the next election in Toronto Centre again. With her initial thoughts, we've been asking throughout our special what you had on your mind as you waited for this budget. Here's another issue you were thinking about.
Hello, my name is Joseph Wong. I am from Edmonton, Alberta. I work currently as a cook at Northern Chicken here. Over this past year, a lot of us have gone through a lot, and for myself, I actually lost my position as a sous chef, as well as the financial difficulties of that. I also lost all benefits, obviously. So it's been a tough road. Definitely hoping that in the new federal budget, it'll provide some assistance to small businesses which employ people like myself that want to get back to normal. We want to work.
Lots of Canadians feeling that way. Preet Banerjee, personal finance expert in Toronto, joins me again. Certainly there's support. The government's promised 1 million jobs to create within a year. The job numbers were good back in March, Preet, but I know because of the lockdowns now, it might not be the case in the months ahead. What do you make of how they're supporting job creation?
Yeah, so they have mentioned a lot of extension of the pandemic supports for small businesses. So there's an extension of the CEWS program. There's an extension of the commercial rent program as well. These look both to be tapering, but will extend until September. They were originally slated to end in June. So that gives some level of comfort to business owners. They've also mentioned that they're going to provide this new incentive, a Canada Recovery Hiring Program, which would also cover 50% of incremental wages paid to either existing employees who are getting more hours, they're getting raises, or you're hiring new people. Right. And then for merchants, this one is kind of interesting. The government said they're going to help negotiate on swipe fees. So it's interesting to know that when you buy something and you go in store, you either pay cash or pay with a card. Well, you can really only pay with a card now because of the pandemic. And if you do a transaction online, the cost to process that transaction is a little bit higher. And so this counts to about 1 to 3.5% of the transaction value. These fees have gone up over time because of the changing nature of payments. And so they're looking to negotiate on that.
Okay, Preet Banerjee, thank you for all your help throughout this special. Appreciate it. Take care of you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rosie.
Okay, talk again soon. Let me bring in the CBC's David Cochrane, who's been guiding us through the ins and outs of the budget. David, at the end of the 700 pages and the speech from the Finance Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, where do you think this leaves us in terms of sort of what I asked at issue there, how we get through this third wave and then what happens next?
Yeah, one of the things that sticks out to me, Rosie, is just how much all of this has cost us. I was looking at the tables in Bill Morneau's budget. We were supposed to have deficits of 20 billion, 15 billion, 12 billion, and 10 billion. We now have deficits of 350 billion, 150 billion, 60 billion, and 50 billion. They're all 5 to 10 times order of magnitude. You're looking at a debt to GDP ratio of 30%. It's now 50%. The human cost has been enormous. The financial cost has been enormous. Hopefully, we're getting to the other side of all of this with vaccinations now rolling out. But the need to extend these programs at a cost of further tens of billions into September shows just how much the cost is and how much more we still need to do.
Yeah, which is something we also saw with the fall fiscal update. They had to inject a lot more there to get us through. David Cochrane, thank you. As always, we'll see you later on The National. Appreciate it. Let me go to Peter Armstrong with 30 seconds for your final thought, Peter.
Look, Rosie, the thing that underpins all of this is economic growth. That the more the economy can grow, the less weight all of that new debt is going to carry. And the best stimulus for everything we've seen in the budget today, the best stimulus that small business owners, that big business owners, that individuals have been telling me they want to see is to get those COVID cases under control. And if we can do that, and if we can see the kind of growth this budget is forecasting, then good times can be ahead. But it's getting through right now that is going to be the hardest part.
That's an awfully good point. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate all your help on our special. Peter Armstrong, Senior Business Correspondent. I'll be back later tonight on The National. We'll have a special edition of At Issue, as well as everything you need to know about the budget. Our coverage continues right now on CBC News Network with Vashi Kapelas and Power and Politics. Just want to thank everyone here for their help with the budget coverage. It's been extraordinary circumstances at an extraordinary time. But as you heard, a huge budget for Canada right now, one that may not lead to an election right now, but could very well in the future. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later on The National. Bye-bye.